Log into Azure portal to create the service bus. Search and click on service bus. We need to create the namespace for the service bus. Click on create. For creating the namespace, we need to provide some basic details like subscription, the resource group, namespace name, location details, and the pricing tier. For this demo, we will be selecting the basic pricing tier and we'll click on review and create. Once the pricing tier has been selected, click on review and create. This will validate all the criteria, and if the validation is succeeded, we can click on create. This will get the deployment started for creating the service bus. So once the deployment is completed, once the service bus has been created, we'll be going to the service bus namespace and we'll be collecting the keys, the shared access keys used for managing the service bus and the queues, and we'll be configuring that in the database. Now the service bus has been created. Go to settings. Under the settings, we have something called shared access policies. Under the shared access policies, we have root manage policy access policy key. So this key will be used for providing the permissions for accessing this Azure Service Bus. We can always regenerate these keys using the above regenerate primary key or secondary key options. Copy this and paste it in a notepad. Once the keys has been copied, under the entities, we need to create the queue. Click on queues and add the queue. Click on create queue. So inside the create queue, we have options to specify the name, maximum queue size, and then other details. Enter the name for creating the queue. Leave the default values for max queue size and then max delay count and the other things to default, and click on create. Once the queue is created, we'll be going inside the queue and we'll be looking at the Service Bus Explorer, a service that will be used for managing these queues. Once the queue has been created, click on the new queue. Inside the new queue, we have something called Service Bus Explorer. Click on Service Bus Explorer. This service will be used for managing all the queues. So whenever the change has been updated in the database tables or something, we'll be receiving the message over here. We will explore this in the upcoming sessions. So far we have created the service bus namespace and we created the queues. Now it's time to create a service endpoints for database entities. In order to do that, we need to install a tool called plugin registration tool. We'll be installing the plugin registration tool via Azure CLI. Once the tool is installed, we'll configure the service endpoints for the Azure Service Bus and we'll add the necessary steps for attaching the service endpoint to the certain entities for getting the updates. One way of installing the plugin registration tool is via CLI, Power Platform CLI. Open the command prompt and type pack tool list. So if you type pack tool list, it will list out all the tools that has been installed on the system. If the plugin registration tool has not installed previously in your system, then the install status will be no. In order to install the plugin registration tool, we need to type pack tool PRT. So once you type that, it will check whether the file exists, whether the tool exists locally. If not, it will install the latest version of the plugin registration tool and it will create the shortcut menu in the start menu and it will install the tool. Once the tool get installed, it will launch the plugin registration tool automatically. So once the tool has been launched, we can create the service endpoints in the plugin registration tool for getting the updates based on the configure entities. Once the plugin registration tool has been launched, we need to create the connection. We need to create the connection for the environment which we need to configure the service endpoints for the Azure Service Bus queue. Click on create new connection and select Office 365 and provide the necessary details. Select the environment which you need to select and click on login. Once you are logged in, we need to create the service endpoint. Click on register and click on create service endpoint. In the service endpoint pop-up, we need to provide the primary connection string which we copied earlier while creating the Azure Service Bus queue and paste it over here. Click on next. This plugin registration tool will automatically detect all the details of the connection string and it will display it for the necessary fields. Here we need to provide the queue name, the service bus queue name under the queue name, and we need to provide under the user information sent, we need to select the user ID. If you want, you can provide the description for the service endpoint registration and click on save. Once the service endpoint connection has been created, right click on the service endpoint connection and click on register new step. Under register new step, we need to configure the entities. This step will establish the connection between the Azure Service Bus and the entities. So once we configure this step, whenever we are creating the new record for the particular entity, the message will be triggered to the Azure Service Bus queue. Later, that message can be processed by any other applications. In the register new step pop-up, we need to select the message. So for the message, we need to type create. So this particular demo is for whenever the account entity is created, the new record in the account entity is created, we'll be sending the information of the created item to the Azure Service Bus queue. Type create in the message and under the primary entity, select the account table. Leave the default values. Under the event pipeline stage of execution, note that it has been selected as post operation. And then execution mode, select asynchronous, and the deployment, leave it as server as default. Click on save new step. Once you save the new step, you can see that the new service connection, a new step has been registered for the service endpoint. So far we have created the Azure Service Bus endpoint and we registered a new step against the accounts entity. Whenever a new item has been added to the accounts entity, the message will be triggered to the Azure Service Bus queue. The next steps are to trigger the action and verify the action in the Service Bus Explorer. In order to trigger the action, we'll be opening the model driven app that is related to the accounts table. So we have created a demo model driven app from the accounts table. We'll be opening that model driven app and update some of the fields for the account table. We'll add a new item for the accounts table, and once the item has been added and saved in the form, it will get triggered to the service bus. The message of creation and the other details will be triggered to the service bus as a JSON response. We'll then go to the Azure portal and go to the service bus and we'll check the queue, Azure Service Bus queue, and we'll be going to the Service Bus Explorer which resides under the queue, and we'll check whether that item new message has been reflected in the Azure Service Bus Explorer. Let's do it. Go to the model driven app and update some of the fields of the account table. Update some of the fields for the accounts table. Here we are updating the account name, phone number and other related fields for the account table. So once the details of the fields has been entered, click on save. Once the form has been saved, the item has been added to the accounts table. Now if we navigate to the Service Bus queue, Service Bus Explorer, we can see under the queue we have one item. Now if we peek that message, we can see that new message details, like all the details of that newly added account item has been centered to this Azure Service Bus queue. If you open that message, we can see all the JSON body structures over here. All the details of the new item will be presented over here. If we want to consume this, we can use some other third-party applications, or we can use the Azure Functions or Power Automate to receive this message, to listen to this message and do some business activities. Now we have seen how to create the service endpoint in the plugin registration tool, how to register the step for the service endpoint in order to listen to that particular action, how to trigger an action from a model driven app. So once the action is triggered, we verify that in the Azure Service Bus Explorer. So we have seen the details of the queue message that has been sent as a JSON response. So once the message is sent to the Azure Service Bus queue, it can be received by any third-party applications. The third-party applications can be like external cloud or can be Azure Function or Power Automate. So in the upcoming demo, we'll be seeing how we can receive the service bus queue in the Power Automate and Azure Function. Let's get started. For this demo, we'll be working on the listener part. For listening to the Azure Service Bus queue, we can either utilize the third-party external cloud applications or we can utilize Azure Function as a listener. So in order to create a Service Bus queue listener via Azure Function, we need to create the Azure Function app first. Log into Azure portal and create a function app. So once the function app is created, under the functions section, click on functions and click on create. So once you click on create, we can see there are so many templates available. So for this demo, we'll be utilizing Azure Service Bus queue template. So this Azure Service Bus queue template will peek the message from the Azure Service Bus whenever a new message has been added to the service bus. So once the message is received to the function, we can then perform the business logic and sync our data between the different business units. So in order to create the Azure Service Bus queue trigger function, we need to provide the function name and the service bus connection, the primary connection string, and then the service bus queue name. So once you entered all the details, click on create. Once the Azure Service Bus queue trigger function is created, click on that and you can see there is a section called code and test. Click on code and test. So in the code and test, we can see that there are two parameters. One is queue item, my queue item, and another one is iLogger message. My queue item is the inbuilt parameter that will be used for getting the queue message from the Azure Service Bus queue. So whenever the message has been received to the Azure Service Bus queue in Azure portal, this my queue item, this function will be called and it will read the message from the queue. It will peek the message from the queue and it will pass it to this function. So once it is passed inside the function, we can write the business scenario based on the purpose of the requirement to read the message and process the message. Once the Azure Service Bus queue trigger, the listener part is created, we'll go to the model driven app again and we'll create a new account item. Create a new account item and save the new item. So once the item has been saved, go to the Azure function again and click on the monitor section. So if you can see the monitor section, we can clearly see that new message has been received as a JSON format. So this message is the queue item. It has been received from the Azure Service Bus queue. So whenever we modify the account table, whenever we create a new item in the account table, the account table will trigger the Azure Service Bus queue. The account table will send the information to the Azure Service Bus queue about the newly created item. In turn, the listener Azure Service Bus queue trigger function will listen to the changes for the Azure Service Bus queue and it will peek the message whenever there is a changes. Now let's see how we can listen to the Azure Service Bus queue via the Power Automate. Go to Power Automate and create a cloud flow. Provide the flow name and in the flow trigger search for service bus. So we'll find a trigger called whenever a message is received in the queue. Select the trigger and click on create. Here we need to provide the authentication type. So we can provide the authentication type like as access key and provide the connection string. Copy the primary string from the Azure Service Bus queue and provide it over here. So once done, click on create. This will create the connection between the Azure Service Bus and this trigger. Right now, the queue trigger listener port is ready via the Power Automate. So with this, we can write the business logic in the Power Automate, or we can pause this request to some other web services, right? So for this demo, we'll add a simple action like send this message to the email pot, and we'll save this flow. So when we modify the account table, when we modify the account table, when we add an item in the account table, the account table will send the message to the Azure Service Bus queue. So once the message is sent to the Azure Service Bus queue, this flow will read the message from the Azure Service Bus queue and it will perform the business needs. Save the flow, and we can test this flow manually. Click on manually and click on test. Now if you go to the model driven app, update or create a new item in the accounts table, create a new item via the model driven app and save the item. So once the item is saved, we can come to the flow, and when we check the run history, we can see that the test has been executed successfully, and we can see the JSON response from the Azure Service Bus queue. This ends our demo. Let's recap. So far, we created the Azure Service Bus queue in the Azure portal. So once the Service Bus queue is triggered, we've taken the connection strings of the Azure Service Bus queue and kept it in handy for registering the service endpoint via the plugin registration tool. So we opened the Azure CLI and we installed the plugin registration tool. So once the plugin registration tool is installed, we went to the plugin registration tool and registered the service endpoint for the Azure Service Bus. So once the Azure Service Bus has been the service endpoint for the Azure Service Bus has been registered, we created a step for listening the accounts entity. So whenever a new item has been created for the account entity for the particular environment, we registered the step for listening to the events. So once the step is registered, we went on to verify the step via the Service Bus Explorer. We went to the model driven app, a test model driven app, and we created a sample item. So once the item has been created, so we saw how the message is triggered to the Azure Service Bus queue. We also created the listener part via the Power Automate and Azure function against the Service Bus queue. So whenever there is a new message in the Service Bus queue, this Power Automate or the Azure function will listen to this message and it will perform the business logic based on the needs. So far we have seen the demo of how to register the service endpoint and how to register the step for Azure Service Bus queue, and how to listen the Azure Service Bus queue messages via the Power Automate and Azure functions. The same way, we can create a service endpoint for the webhooks, generic webhooks, or the Azure function triggered HTTP triggered webhooks, or we can register the service endpoint for the Azure Event Hub. Choosing Service Bus versus Webhook versus Azure Event Hub depends upon the business scenarios. We can choose either one of these or a multiple of these based on the business needs. We'll see in the following demos how to register the service endpoint for Webhook and Azure Event Hub. First, let's start with the Azure Event Hub demo. Log into Azure portal and create the Azure Event Hub first. Search for Event Hub and click on Create. Before proceeding with creating the Event Hub, we need to create the namespace for the Event Hub. So provide the subscription resource group and then instance name details and select the basic pricing tier, review on Create. Once you click on Create, the deployment will get started and the Event Hub will be created. So when the Event Hub is created, under the entities, click on Event Hubs and click on Create New Event Hub. So we need to fill in the name for the Event Hub and then leave the rest of the things as default and click on Review on Create. This will get started in creating the Event Hub. Once this Event Hub is created, we'll be going to the plugin registration tool and register this Event Hub in the plugin registration tool as a service endpoint. Before that, copy the SAT access policies keys and save it in a notepad. We'll be needing that while registering the service endpoint for the Event Hub. Once the Event Hub is created, open the plugin registration tool. In the plugin registration tool, click on Register and click on Register New Service Endpoint. So in the new service endpoint, we need to select the namespace. In the new service endpoint, paste the connection strings of the event hub and click on next. So in the service endpoint registration, we need to update the destination type as event hub and type the event hub name and select the message format as JSON and click on save. Once the service endpoint is saved, we can see that new service endpoint has been added in the plugin registration tool. Right click on the newly created service endpoint for the event hub and click on register new step. In the register new step, we need to follow the steps like exactly the same like while creating the Azure Service Bus step. So we need to select the message as create, primary entity as account, and all other details will be filled automatically. You can see that event pipeline stage of execution is post operation and the execution mode is asynchronous. Click on save. So once the step is saved, we can go ahead with updating or creating any item in the model driven app for the accounts table, and we can check whether the messages has been posted to the Azure Event Hub. Go to PowerApps and select the demo model driven app related to the accounts table. Open the app and create a new item in the form for the accounts table. Enter some of the fields values and save and close. So once the form is saved or once the new item is created versus the account table, navigate to the Azure portal and click on Event Hub. Go to Event Hub and click on Process Data under Futures. You can see there are so many options available for processing the data for the Event Hub. We can process the messages in the Cosmos DB, or we can start a blank canvas to analyze the messages, or we can use some data factory tools for analyzing and processing the messages. In this demo, we'll be processing the data via the Azure Stream Analytic Query language. So click on Start under the Enable Real-Time Insights from Events. So once you click on Start, this will open the Azure Stream Analytics Query language tool, and here click on Test Query. So if you click on Test Query, this will provide us all the messages that have been processed via the Event Hub. Here we can see that Event Hub Demo 101 is the message that we got from the demo model driven app. So we created the new item in the model driven app that triggered this service endpoint for the Azure Event Hub. So once the message has been processed, we can analyze that message via the Stream Analytics query, or we can listen to this message via any third party listeners. So far we have seen how to register the service endpoint for Azure Event Hub in the plugin registration tool. We also created the step for the accounts entity. Whenever a create action is performed against the accounts entity, we received a JSON response to the Azure Event Hub. We also tested via model driven app, and we analyzed the message in the Stream Analytics in the Azure Event Hub. In the upcoming demo, we will see how to create the service endpoint for the webhooks. So for creating service endpoint for the webhook, we'll be using HTTP triggered Azure function. Go to Azure portal and search for function app. Provide the subscription details and then the publish method, runtime stack, and create the function app. So once this function app is created, we'll be creating the HTTP triggered function inside this function app. So once the HTTP triggered function is created, we'll be using those details in the service endpoint for the webhook. Now the function app is created. Go to functions. Inside the functions, click on create. In the create function, search for HTTP triggered. Select the HTTP triggered template and click on create. Once the Azure function is created, HTTP triggered function is created, go to plugin registration tool. In the plugin registration tool, click on register and click on register new webhook. So once you click on register new webhook, we can see the Webhook registration pop-up. In the Webhook registration pop-up, we need to provide the name for the Webhook registration and we need to provide the endpoint URL. And for now, we are using the authentication type as Webhook key because we are using the HTTP triggered Azure function. So we need to use the authentication as Webhook key. So if you are using any generic Webhook, we can select the authentication type as key value pair. Since we choose the HTTP triggered Azure function, we'll be using Webhook key. Copy the value of the function key from the function app and paste it over here under the value and click on save. Once you save the Webhook registration, the Webhook will be registered for that particular environment. Then right click on the Webhook service endpoint and click on register new step. This step is exactly the same step we have created previously for the service bus and event hub. We need to follow the same procedure. We need to select the message as create and we need to select the primary entity as account, and we need to leave other things as default. Click on register new step. So once this step has been registered, we can go to the model driven app and create a new item in the model driven app against the account entity. We'll go to the PowerApps and create a new item in the model driven app and click on save. Once we save the item, we'll go to the Azure function and click on monitor. So this Azure function monitor will listen to the incoming events for the HTTP triggered events. So once the item has been saved in the accounts table, the accounts table passes the information to the HTTP triggered webhook function. We can see the JSON response of the newly created item over here. So far we have seen how to create the webhook, like the HTTP triggered Azure function webhook, and how to create the service endpoint for the webhook. And we also tested that action from the test model driven app. This ends our demo of creating the service endpoints for all the integrations like Azure Service Bus, Event Hub and Webhooks. So far we have created Azure Service Bus, Azure Event Hub and Webhooks in the Azure portal and how to register the service endpoint against those services. We also registered step and start listening to those actions. We also tested the trigger actions using the demo model driven app against the account entities. We also verify the messages that have been triggered. We also seen how to create the listener applications that listens to these services. Like we created the listener for Azure Service Bus, like we created the Azure Service Bus queue Azure function, and then in Power Automate we created a cloud flow that listens to the Azure Service Bus queue, which listens to the Azure Service Bus queue as a listener application and perform the business cases. The same listener applications can be created for the Azure Event Hub and Webhooks. It depends upon the business scenarios and requirements. Hope you find the demo useful. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.